Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at something pretty crucial for making it through a disaster, your brain, and how it really works under pressure. Because trust me, Hollywood's got it all wrong.
Right. Forget those screaming hordes you see in the movies. We're going to be looking at some really surprising research about how people actually react when things go sideways.
Yeah, like what really happens in those
Yeah.
crazy moments, and what can we learn from the people who actually made it out?
Well, we've got a lot of fascinating material to dig into today. Amanda Ripley's book, Unthinkable, Who Survives When and Why is a great starting point. But we're also going to be looking at some historical accounts and scientific studies, too.
So we're talking real life stuff, not just theories. What can we do to boost our own chances of survival?
Exactly. Buckle up because we're about to challenge some serious assumptions.
Sounds good to me.
So Ripley lays out this idea called the survival arc. It's basically like three phases that almost everyone goes through in a disaster.
Okay, so stage one is denial. Is this like when my smoke alarm's going off and I'm standing there sniffing the air? Like, is that toast or is this it?
Yeah, exactly. That hesitation, that refusal to believe that it's really happening, it's our brain's way of buying time to process this massive shock. But that can have consequences.
Right, like in the 9/11 World Trade Center evacuation, Ripley talks about how people took way longer to get out than they should have.
Exactly. A lot of them were stuck in that denial phase, but then they moved into stage two,
Yeah.
deliberation.
Deliberation, okay.
Yeah, they were milling about, talking to each other, trying to gather information, trying to make sense of it all before taking action.
So it's almost like our brains need that time, even if it seems like we should be running.
Right, it's not just about blind panic, it's about trying to understand what's going on.
So what's happening inside our heads during that deliberation phase?
Well, fear is basically taking over. The amygdala, which is our brain's alarm system, kicks in, and rational thought kind of goes out the window. Time starts to feel warped. We get fixated on weird details.
Ripley mentions this ambassador, Diego Sensio, who was held hostage. And he said time felt totally distorted. But he also got hyper-focused on this Norman Mailer book he had with him.
That's so interesting. It shows how our brains seek comfort in the familiar during chaos. It's not always just about panic. It's about trying to find something that makes sense in a world that suddenly feels really crazy.
So we've got denial, then we're trying to make sense of things. But it seems like some people are just better at handling this kind of stress than others.
Oh, absolutely. We all have a baseline level of resilience. You could call it our ability to bounce back from stress. But some people, like this Israeli police commander, Brigadier General Mishka Shaham, they seem to have a superpowered version of it.
He works in high-tension situations all the time, but he just stays incredibly calm. Is that just luck of the draw, or can we train ourselves to be more resilient?
That's the million-dollar question. Shaham says he still feels fear, but he's learned to manage it. So while some of it might be innate, I think there are definitely strategies we can learn to improve our own responses under pressure.
So thinking back to that survival arc idea, it sounds like just knowing those stages exist is a good first step. Like if we realize we're in denial, maybe we can snap out of it quicker. And if we understand that deliberation is totally normal, we can use that time more effectively.
Exactly. And by learning about how fear affects us, we can start to develop those coping mechanisms, those mental anchors that'll help us navigate the chaos and make better decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about how our brains react in a crisis, but
Yeah.
disasters don't really happen to just one person at a time, right?
Right. We're never really alone in those situations.
So what happens when you throw other people into the mix?
Well, the way groups behave can completely change how things play out, sometimes for the better, sometimes not.
Ripley uses that Beverly Hills Supper Club fire as an example.
Hmm.
Hundreds of people were trapped. But there were also all these incredible stories of people cooperating,
Yeah.
right in the middle of all that chaos.
Yeah, you'd expect it to be pure panic, every man for himself. But that's often not what happens at all.
So what was going on there?
Well, in the supper club fire, people's roles actually seemed to influence what they did. Waiters started helping guide people out. Doctors who happened to be there jumped in to give aid.
Wow, so it's almost like their instincts from everyday life kicked in and gave them a sense of purpose even in this terrifying situation.
Exactly, and it might sound counterintuitive, but sometimes that kind of structure can actually help people stay calmer and make better decisions.
So it's not just about blind panic.
Right, it's more complex than that.
Okay, so this idea that people kind of fall into those familiar roles in a disaster, is that something we can train for, or is it purely instinctual?
That's a good question. I think some of it is definitely instinct, but just understanding this dynamic can help us be more prepared. Well, if we know that people tend to fall into these familiar roles in a crisis, maybe we can be more aware of our own potential to step up and help, you know, to offer guidance or support to others.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think about the whole idea of like the herd instinct.
Yeah.
If we see someone taking charge, even if it's just some random person who seems to know what they're doing, we're probably going to follow them.
Exactly. And Ripley talks about the Who concert stampede. This teenager in a gold smock ended up kind of unintentionally leading a group to safety.
Just because he was wearing a gold smock.
Well, it was more than that. It's just that he was visible and he was moving with purpose. So in that chaotic moment, he kind of became a leader by default.
So it wasn't like he had any actual authority.
No, not really. But he was projecting this sense of calm and direction. And that can make a huge difference in a crisis.
Right, because if you see someone who seems to know what they're doing, it's natural to want to follow them.
Exactly.
This also makes me think about firefighter Jim Klein's story from 9/11. When that gas tank exploded, people instinctively ran towards the fire truck
Yeah, even though logically they should have been running away from the explosion.
because the fire truck represented safety.
Right. It was like a symbol of authority and help.
So even in those extreme moments, we're still looking for guidance and protection.
Yeah, it's a powerful instinct.
But this also means we need to be careful who we follow in a crisis.
Exactly.
Because what if everyone's following the wrong lead?
That's when things can get really dangerous.
So critical thinking is still super important, even when our instincts are telling us to just go with the flow. Okay, so we've talked about how our brains try to make sense of a disaster and how that herd instinct can make us want to follow other people. But what if the best way to survive is to actually do nothing?
That might sound kind of counterintuitive, but sometimes freezing in place is actually the smartest move you can make.
Really?
Yeah, Ripley calls this negative panic, and it happens more often than you might think.
I'll admit my first instinct in a crisis is usually to do something. Anything. But you're saying that could be the wrong move.
Well, it really depends on the situation, of course. But Ripley talks about this research by Dr. Gordon Gallup Jr. He studied something called tonic immobility in animals.
Tonic immobility.
Yeah, it's basically like when animals freeze up when they're faced with a threat.
Like playing dead.
Exactly. He found that everything from chickens to primates do it.
So it's not just fear paralyzing them, it's like an actual instinct.
Right, and it's not just animals either.
So you're saying humans do this too?
Yeah, think about Clave Island. He was one of the survivors of the Virginia Tech shooting. And he said that when the shooting started, he just instinctively dropped to the floor and stayed still, even as the shooter was moving through the room.
Wow, so it wasn't like a conscious decision or anything.
No, it was just his body's automatic response.
That's incredible.
And it really challenges this idea that we always have to either fight or flee.
Right, because sometimes neither of those options is actually going to help you.
Exactly.
So are there other examples of this, like freeze response actually saving lives?
Oh yeah, definitely. Ripley talks about this Israeli counterterrorism commander who was observing one of his team's operations, and he noticed that while some people ran for cover when the shooting started, a lot of them just froze. They hit the ground and stayed there until the threat had passed.
So in that case, that negative panic might have actually kept them out of the line of fire.
Exactly.
It's not about giving up or anything.
Right, it's about our primal instincts kicking in. And sometimes those instincts can actually give us a better chance of survival.
Okay, so this whole idea of freezing up instead of panicking, it makes me wonder about the whole concept of panic in general. Is it really as common as we think it is?
That's another misconception that Ripley tackles in her book. She argues that true panic, like that irrational, uncontrollable behavior, is actually pretty rare.
Really?
Yeah, look at the London Blitz, for example. Even though people were constantly under threat of being bombed, they generally maintained order and followed instructions.
So if it's not as common as we think what actually causes true panic, then...
Well, this sociologist, Enrico Quarantelli, identified 3 key things that have to be present for panic to occur. 1, feeling trapped, or like you're about to be trapped. 2, feeling totally helpless. And 3, feeling completely isolated.
So it's not just fear itself.
Right. It's that combination of all those specific factors that can really lead to those chaotic scenes we see in movies.
So if you're not feeling all 3 of those things at the same time, you're probably not going to truly panic.
Exactly. And this also highlights how important clear communication and good leadership are in a crisis. Because if people have information and if they feel like there's a plan in place, they're a lot less likely to panic.
That makes sense.
And Ripley points out that using panic as like a catch-all excuse can actually be dangerous.
How so?
Well, it can lead to people withholding information from the public, which ironically makes panic more likely, not less.
Wow, so this whole deep dive has really changed how I think about surviving a disaster. It's not just about being physically prepared. It's also about understanding how our brains work under pressure and recognizing how powerful group dynamics can be, and even knowing when to just stay put.
Exactly. It's about challenging those assumptions we have about how we're supposed to react. We need to move past those simplistic ideas of fight or flight and panic and really embrace this more complex understanding of how humans behave in these extreme situations.
It's been a fascinating journey for sure. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that knowledge really is power. The more we understand about ourselves and how we behave in crises, the better equipped we'll be to make smart decisions and increase our chances of survival.
Absolutely. And remember, even in the face of tragedy, we see these incredible stories of resilience and courage and compassion. This deep dive wasn't just about surviving, it's about thriving and about using this knowledge to build a safer and more resilient future for ourselves and for our communities.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned some valuable insights and maybe even came away with a renewed sense of hope.